Greetings, Exiles, I'm Gav. Path of Exile 2 has been upon us for over 5 months now, and its release didn't come without a cost. For some folks, that cost was trust. This video will be going over the concept of a trust bank. To understand this concept, here's a clip from an interview with Chris Wilson conducted by Josh Strifehays.
Let's take a slight sidetrack here and talk about the idea of the company's relationship with the players. I've often believed that goodwill is a currency. If a company do something that the player base perceive as good and positive, the player base will trust them. And that trust gets built up and built up and built up, and the company can, if they choose to, cash that trust in for very, very large amounts of profit very quickly at the expense of that trust from the future. How do you build up that player trust? What is it that you do as a company that you think the players do trust? And I'm not saying that you're going to do anything that would cash that trust out, but what do you then see companies doing that you think is an unacceptable cash out of that trust?
I see what you mean. Yeah, it's very interesting. The terms like brand deposit and brand withdrawal, we heard at a talk at a conference back in like 2008 or 9, and that was a very, poignant thing that stuck with us from there, where, the idea is treat people well and later you can treat them badly. Sounds like a really cynical way to run businesses, but we've always had a philosophy of doing best by the players because we're up against large companies that have far more resources than us, and the defining characteristic of those large companies often is they inexplicably do stuff that isn't in the best interest of players. And some of those are our major competitors. And so we can differentiate ourselves by actually taking a step back and working out what the right choice in a given situation is. It also helps that we are gamers, like we go home and play games and are the consumers of these products. It just so happens that we get to make them during our day job. And so we know how we would want to be treated. And so we try very hard to be transparent with the community. We, do interviews like this. We talk to different content creators from various different places, make sure to, explain why we do things. We post, there's a news post on pathofexile.com every single weekday for like the last 8 or 9 years or something like that, because we want to have some content there every day for players. If we make a mistake, the players tell us, we apologize, we explain what's going on, we change it if necessary. So we try very hard to do what's in the best interest of the players. Not really to ever try to cash it out later, but it does sometimes come in handy, because sometimes a business has to make a decision which looks bad to the players, even though it's not going to hurt them.
As Chris said, the team at Grinding Gear Games and the founders themselves are all just gamers at heart. They lived in the worlds that they built. Chris stepped back from active development around 2022 and is now, as of 2025, officially retired from the board of directors. GGG's leadership torch has passed to Jonathan Rogers and Mark Roberts. While the studio's passion hasn't changed, they're currently going through what I would call some growing pains. Before I get into the video fully, this isn't to dunk on Jonathan or Mark, not in the slightest. I respect the hell out of both of them as developers. Jonathan Rogers was one of the original minds behind Path of Exile's combat and core systems. Him and Chris met in their high school library in New Zealand. They bonded while chatting about computers and programming, becoming fast friends. Jonathan is a co-founder of Grinding Gear Games, and while he's held many titles, in the early days he was the lead programmer and technical director for the company. You'd find Jonathan in the occasional interview over the years, during their press touring for League launches, or on a podcast with Path of Exile content creators. But for the most part, he was always in the shadows, just tinkering away and making improvements to the game in the back end. In the early days, he was literally the technical backbone of the company, particularly when it came to combat mechanics and calculations, networking, basically everything behind the scenes that makes the game function. Mark Roberts started off as just a player of Path of Exile. Though not just any player. He was a top 20 hardcore racer and Giga Chad gamer. Mark was hired on at GGG as a QA tester, shortly after the release of the game. Within just a few years, he was already assisting Chris Wilson with production of League launches and the organization of race events. Mark has an encyclopedic knowledge for the game, and he's worn a lot of hats within the company over the course of the game's development. As Chris Wilson stepped back from day-to-day leadership as Path of Exile 1's game director, Jonathan and Mark stepped up and began work on patch 4.0, which was going to be a completely separate campaign with a combined endgame. This patch would later be dubbed Path of Exile 2. Jonathan Rogers became the game director of Path of Exile 2, and Mark Roberts became the game director of Path of Exile 1. And he assisted a lot with the early development of Path of Exile 2, and he's still currently assisting. He made a large majority, if not all, of the boss encounters. Let's talk briefly about how Chris Wilson and Grinding Gear Games earned our trust and respect over the years. In previous videos, I've already covered the early history of Grinding Gear Games, and I did another video on how the community was carefully curated by Chris, Bex, and others on the team. But I'll still provide a few examples of how that trust was built in the first place. Path of Exile is what I like to call a free-to-try game. You can play the entire campaign through to endgame with no upfront cost. Sure, you might want stash tabs once you get into maps, but you'd only make that purchase if the game has already hooked you. And that's really the key. GGG has never paywalled power or progression in their game. Their monetization model is more than just fair. It's one of the most ethical in the industry. Players choose to support Grinding Gear Games willingly, but your support is never demanded to play the content that they create, and it'll be like that for the entire lifespan of both games. Their consistency in this monetization method and free-to-play nature earned a ton of trust and respect from the community and the ARPG genre as a whole. That model was part of a larger philosophy, shaped largely by Chris Wilson. For years, he was the public face of the game. Chris was calm, measured, and deeply connected to the community through direct communication on the forums, as well as Reddit and in interviews. He had a vision of what a great ARPG should be, a little bit uncompromising in some ways, but never disconnected from feedback. Another key piece of the puzzle that Chris had that Jonathan is lacking is a dedicated community manager, Bex. Bex was the boots on the ground. She was in on Reddit threads, Twitter posts, the forums, you name it. Through her, it felt like we had a direct line into the studio. And that's where GGG stands out. They listen. Not always perfectly, not always instantly, but when the community raises its voice, they respond. Whether it's complete overhauls, league rebalances, or quality of life features, Grinding Gear Games is often willing to pivot when the message is made clear. And that's how they built up trust, through consistency, communication, and course correction for over a decade. To this day, GGG at its core still represents what I believe a game studio should strive to be. But under the new tenure of Jonathan Rogers and his vision for Path of Exile 2, there's been a lack of consistency, direction, and certainty. The bank of trust that was built up over the years is being withdrawn from currently. Trust is being spent every day that Path of Exile 1 players wait for content that keeps getting pushed back. Patch 3.25 Settlers of Kalgur released on July 26, 2024, and it was PoE1's most successful league yet. That momentum and growth, however, immediately took a back seat for the development of the sequel. Patch 3.26 continues being delayed over and over, the longest gap in the game's history between patches, and it's not even a contest. For longtime players of the game, it's not just frustrating, it's kind of uncharted territory. It's a little worrying. The reason this happened is mostly due to the PoE1 dev team being moved to work on Path of Exile 2. This was an order made by Jonathan Rogers himself. It was a major misstep in terms of management of resources, and it wasn't really something that Jonathan wanted to do in the first place, but in order to launch Path of Exile 2 into early access by the end of 2024, this was just something that he inevitably needed to do, especially after multiple delays already. The consistency that veterans could once rely on from GGG has slowly been deteriorating. New players who have never touched PoE1 or bounced off of it might not care much at all about the original game. They're just here to enjoy an exciting new ARPG in Path of Exile 2. And if they're not feeling it right now, they might revisit it in a future patch, or when it leaves early access and enters 1.0. And that's completely fair, that's pretty normal. Even though I'm a PoE2 main myself, I personally have apathy for the PoE1 folks. I've seen this before. Different game, but the same issue. The year was 2015. The place? Azeroth. 15 grueling months of content drought in Warlords of Draenor while waiting for Legion to save World of Warcraft. That experience made me understand something important. Content lulls don't just make players bored. They break routines. They make people move on from your game. There's been a few bones that have been thrown to the Path of Exile 1 community, but it's definitely not enough and they deserve more. There was the Necro Settlers League, which was just a combination of Necropolis and Settlers League. It ran from November of 2024 to February 2025. After that came Legacy of Frisia, which had some new content, which was basically all scrapped content and ideas that they had. I didn't personally play it, but it did seem like a really neat concept and a lot of cool ideas. But again, it was still Settlers League at its core. And then this month, a special set of private leagues were made available, which is an opportunity for some community-run servers and fresh starts, but again, it's still Settlers League. I sincerely hope that the PoE1 community gets the love and attention that they deserve from GGG. They're the old guard. Personally though, I was ready for a fresh start, as well as some modernization. I love PoE1, don't get me wrong, but I lean more toward PoE2's design and direction, and WASD. The main draw though was the blank slate that I never really got to experience in the first game. I joined PoE1 pretty late into Breach League back in 2016, and I was always pretty intimidated to make my own builds, because I always wanted to push the highest content, so I would pretty much just copy somebody's build every league. But after seeing the insane player numbers achieved with the launch of Early Access, hundreds of thousands of new players as well as crossover from your original audience, that's just crazy. I can honestly see why they're focusing on getting the sequel to the point where the community and devs are happy with it, and they want to hold on to that new audience that they brought in. My main struggle with the development of PoE2 though is the lack of clarity. Under Chris Wilson, there was always a clear vision. Memes aside about the vision, it's really important to have one. You might not have liked every decision, but you knew why it was being made. You knew it came from someone who had a long-term plan, and honestly, a lot of those plans panned out. Under Jonathan, the vision feels more reactive than proactive, like it's being discovered in real time instead of shaped and curated. He said before that he just wants to create an amazing ARPG, something that he enjoys because he knows himself. That's a noble goal, and one that I have faith that him, Mark, and the team will eventually achieve, but it doesn't quite give the community a strong sense of direction. Right now, it feels more like a dream than a roadmap. I honestly don't think that there's a single chance that 1.0 hits this year, and if it does, I think that's a mistake. Combine all of this with the disjointed feeling of patch 0.1's campaign versus how the endgame felt, and then the complete 180 in terms of player strength and loot in patch 0.2. I think the baseline is still being established and they can adjust from there, but we're still pretty far off from having every single class and weapon type, all the skills and support gems, all the uniques, and so on. Through all of their blunders, however, and despite all of the anger within the community and absolutely deranged Reddit posts, Jonathan, Mark, and the team have pressed on and done their best to please the player base, both new and old exiles. For over a month now, they've had a patch every week or at least every other, and it's slowly been making Path of Exile 2 better and better, all while picking up the pieces and course correcting the development and content cadence of Path of Exile 1. It's not all doom and gloom. There's definitely another side of the coin to all this. Jonathan and Mark have made some bold and honestly brilliant decisions. The nerfs in patch 0.2 might have been jarring, I completely agree, but it also showed how quickly the team can pivot when something isn't working. 0.1's endgame and power scaling was way off from where they wanted the game to be. They needed to establish a new baseline through major nerfs and work up from there with buffs. Patch 0.2 released on April 4th to mixed reviews, and a feeling of sluggishness from the player base while going through the campaign. On April 8th, after a full weekend of community backlash regarding this patch, both Jonathan and Mark sat down live with Gavryn on his stream for an interview, and for us to hear their insights on some of the decisions that were made in 0.2. A lot of the feedback was given and discussions were had about the state of the game, and it was kind of a bloodbath. But Jonathan, and particularly Mark, agreed on a lot of the community's sentiments, and said that they would look into everything after the interview. Sitting down with a major streamer of your game for an in-depth interview after a negative reception to a patch, that takes balls, man. And they made some extremely constructive changes to address all the feedback head on, all while still aligning with their design goals. Every single patch adds depth, smooths out rough edges, and makes the vision as a whole more tangible. It also feels like the quality of life and gameplay improvement patches are happening much more frequently with patch 0.2, basically every week or every other at this point. It makes the state of the game feel much more like an early access that's being iterated on, rather than a full release, and that's where I'm still hopeful. Path of Exile 2 is being built right out in the open, and our feedback matters, positive and negative. We're going to see the awkward middle stages, the half-finished systems, the balance pivots, all in real time. The remainder of early access is going to be messy, I pretty much guarantee it, but if Grinding Gear Games can keep up the cadence of meaningful updates, if they can communicate more clearly about what's coming and reassure their community that both games still matter, then I believe GGG can earn back the trust that they're spending right now to build that bank back up, because we've all seen what this studio is capable of. I think in time, once the growing pains have fully subsided, we'll see it again. We might already be looking at it. That about wraps this video up. Overall, I've got faith that they'll correct course and be properly managing both games by the end of this year. Do you? And what are your thoughts on grinding gear games as a whole right now? I'd really love to hear from you down in those comments. The development of Path of Exile 2 isn't slowing down, and before long, it will hopefully be the well-oiled machine that we know the studio is capable of producing. GGG has always done well with constructive feedback. That's rare in a game studio. And for me, it's worth sticking around for the end result. We're not just watching a sequel take shape, we're watching a studio rediscover itself. They're learning to balance not one, but two live service games. And they've actually lost some major resources in Chris Wilson, Krishi, and Rory recently. But if they get it right in the end, we all win. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe to my channel for more Path of Exile 2 and ARPG content, and drop some build ideas for me for PoE2 down in the comments. Have fun and stay sane, Exiles. Farewell.